For nearly 2 decades, Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban were held up as proof that love could survive anything. The red carpets, the award show dedications, the matching interviews where they spoke about each other in almost reverent terms, it all painted a picture of a marriage that had somehow cracked the code. Two enormously successful people, wildly different worlds, and yet, by every outward appearance, deeply committed to each other. But in 2025, that picture changed. And what followed was something the world hadn't quite seen from Nicole Kidman before, not a managed public statement, not a carefully crafted narrative, but something closer to raw, unfiltered truth. Nicole Kidman, one of Hollywood's most private and composed figures, began letting the world see something real. And what she revealed, about her marriage, about the years she spent holding everything together, and about the moment she finally stopped, has reshaped how people see both of them. To understand where things ended, you have to go back to where they began. Nicole and Keith met in January 2005 at the Day USA Gala in Los Angeles, an event celebrating Australian talent in America. At the time, Nicole was at a complicated crossroads. She had won her Academy Award for The Hours in 2003, which was a triumphant professional moment. But her personal life had been shaken by her highly publicized divorce from Tom Cruise in 2001, and the years that followed were ones of rebuilding her career, her confidence, and her sense of what her life could look like. Keith Urban, the New Zealand-born, Australian-raised country star, was riding the wave of genuine commercial success in Nashville. But he was also, by his own admission in multiple interviews over the years, still wrestling with the weight of addiction. Alcohol had been a recurring battle, one he had spoken about openly in the years since getting help. When they met, something connected. Keith has said in interviews that he was initially too intimidated to call her after that first meeting. When he finally did, things moved with a kind of certainty. They married in June 2006 in Sydney, and by most accounts it was a deeply personal and emotional ceremony, intimate in the way that events attended by two very famous people rarely manage to be. What came just months later was the first real test. In October 2006, Keith checked himself into a rehabilitation center for alcohol addiction. It was only 4 months after the wedding. Nicole, rather than distancing herself from the situation, stood by him publicly and privately. She visited him during treatment. She spoke about it with a kind of quiet steadiness that many people admired. In later years, Keith would reference her support during that period in interviews and award speeches with what appeared to be genuine emotion, calling her his anchor more than once. What followed was, in many ways, a genuine effort to build a life together. Their daughters, Sunday Rose, born in 2008, and Faith Margaret, born via surrogate in 2010, became the center of gravity around which the family organized itself. Nicole spoke often about motherhood as something that had reshaped her priorities. Keith, for his part, framed the family as the stabilizing force in a life that had once been unmoored. But the life they were trying to build came with structural tensions that were always present, even if rarely discussed. Nicole's career required her to be in different countries for months at a time. She is one of the most consistently working actors in Hollywood, taking on a remarkable range of projects across film and prestige television throughout the 2010s and into the 2020s. Keith's career as a touring musician meant extended periods on the road, surrounded by the particular intensity that comes with live performance and late nights. These are not unusual pressures for two people at the top of demanding industries. But they are real ones. And over the years, people who follow both of their careers closely began noticing something. The public appearances together became less frequent. The joint interviews became rarer. The spontaneous-seeming moments that had defined the early years of their public image gradually gave way to something more formal, more managed. This is, of course, natural for any couple that has been together for many years. Public affection settles into something quieter. But with Nicole and Keith, observers began to sense something more than just the comfortable settling of a long marriage. There was a distance that felt less like contentment and more like effort. One of the things that has emerged more clearly in the wake of their separation is just how much Nicole Kidman had been holding together, and for how long. People who know Nicole describe her as someone who is fiercely private about personal pain, who defaults to composure almost as a reflex, and who holds her family relationships with an almost protective intensity. This makes sense when you consider her history. Her divorce from Tom Cruise in 2001 was followed by a custody arrangement regarding their adopted children, Isabella and Connor, that left Nicole largely estranged from them as they grew up. That loss, public, painful, and never fully explained, clearly marked her in ways she has only occasionally alluded to in interviews. When she married Keith, she wasn't just choosing a partner. She was choosing a second chance at the kind of family life she felt she had lost. That context is essential for understanding why she stayed through difficulties that other people might have walked away from much earlier. Leading wasn't just about leading a marriage. For Nicole, it would have carried echoes of a loss she had already experienced and never fully recovered from. This is the dimension that makes her story in 2025 so significant. When someone who has already paid the price of walking away once finally chooses to do it again, this time on her own terms, it says something about how far things had gone. The specifics of what led to the formal end of Nicole and Keith's marriage in 2025 have not been fully disclosed by either party, as would be expected. Neither of them is the kind of public figure who airs private grievances in detail, at least not directly. What is clear from their public timelines is that by 2024, their parallel careers had created a kind of sustained physical separation that is difficult to maintain a marriage through. Nicole was working extensively on projects in Europe. Keith was touring and recording. Their public appearances together, which had always been part of how they maintained their narrative as a couple, became increasingly infrequent. Nicole gave an interview to Vogue in late 2025, timed, as these things often are, to a major project, in which she was described by the interviewer as reflective and somewhat uncertain in a way that was unusual for her. Her comments were not explicitly about her marriage, but several lines in the piece read differently in retrospect. She spoke about the difficulty of thinking you know where your life is heading and then discovering it is going somewhere else entirely. She spoke about the things you cannot control no matter how hard you try. For people who were paying attention, it was less a conversation about career and more a glimpse at something personal. When the separation became public knowledge, what struck many observers was the composure Nicole maintained. There were no public statements designed to shape the narrative to her advantage. There were no pointed social media posts. There was simply the factual reality of the situation, allowed to exist without a framework of spin. Keith Urban's response to the public knowledge of the split was, by contrast, more visible, and more surprising to many people who had admired his public expressions of love for Nicole over the years. He continued performing, as one would expect. But the changes in his stage presentation drew attention. His wedding ring was absent. Certain songs that had been associated with their relationship were altered or dropped. The adjustments were noticeable enough that audiences remarked on them, and the footage circulated widely online. What this revealed, for many people, was a version of Keith Urban that stood in some contrast to the devoted, grateful husband he had presented publicly for years. The man who had said at multiple award shows that Nicole saved his life, who had described her as his reason for everything, was now on stage signaling the end in ways that felt less like grief and more like relief. This is where Nicole's silence became its own kind of statement. She did not respond. She did not offer a counter-narrative. She let his public behavior speak, and by doing so, she allowed the contrast between his performance and hers to be seen clearly by anyone who was watching. The most striking thing about Nicole Kidman's handling of the end of her marriage is not anything she explicitly revealed. It is the way she stopped concealing. For years, her public persona had been built partly on the image of the marriage itself, the devoted wife, the stable anchor, the woman who had helped a troubled man find his footing and built a family in the process. Walking away from that required her to let go of a part of her own narrative identity. In the weeks and months following the public split, she appeared in photographs with her daughters. She spoke in interviews about work, about her daughters' futures, about the importance of stability for them. She made clear, without spelling it out, that her priority had shifted, that she was no longer in the business of managing the image of a partnership that no longer existed. Friends and sources close to her, speaking to various outlets, painted a picture of a woman who had reached a point of genuine clarity. The heartbreak was real, they said. The love had been real. But so had the exhaustion of being the person who holds everything together while the other person decides whether they want to stay. Nicole Kidman has spent the better part of 4 decades being one of the most watched women in the world. She has been scrutinized through an Oscar campaign, a high-profile divorce, a period of professional uncertainty, a remarkable career resurgence, and now, the end of a marriage she clearly believed in. What 2025 revealed is something that does not often happen with people at her level of fame: genuine vulnerability without calculation. The things she said, and the things she refused to say, told a story that did not need embellishment. A woman who had given a great deal of herself to a relationship that eventually stopped being reciprocal. A woman who, after years of protecting her family's image at some cost to her own, decided to simply stop performing. She has not exposed Keith Urban in the tabloid sense of that word. She has not released private information or made accusations. What she has done is something quieter and, in many ways, more powerful. She has stopped covering for the gap between the public story and the private one. And in doing that, she has let the world see what was actually there. For the people who admired Nicole and Keith as a couple, the end of their marriage is a loss of something they wanted to believe in. But for the people who admire Nicole Kidman specifically, 2025 may come to represent something different: the moment she decided that her own truth was worth more than the image she had spent 2 decades carefully maintaining. That is not a small thing. For a woman who lost so much the first time she walked away from a marriage, choosing to do it again, this time clearly, quietly, and on her own terms, is its own kind of statement. The perfect Hollywood marriage may be over. But what Nicole Kidman is left with is something more durable than any red carpet image: the knowledge that she finally chose herself.